Welcome to the Asia Society. My name I'm the managing editor of ChinaFile, the online magazine of the Center on U.S. China Relations here at Asia Society. Very pleased that you could join us. Before we get to this evening's event and our distinguished guest, I'd like to give you a few quick announcements. Tomorrow, Wednesday at 6 at the Time Warner Center, the Asia Society's 9th Diversity Leadership Forum, whose theme this year is Powering Asia Talent, Innovation Through Inclusion, will commence. Wednesday, June 31st at 8 a.m. here in this building, Kevin Rudd, the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, will host Graham Allison, director of Harvard's Belford Center on Science and International Affairs, to talk about his new book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? That's a tongue-tyer for anyone. Thursday, June 1st, kicks off several nights of screenings here at our auditorium downstairs of Japanese cinema with a program of short films beginning at 6:30. Find more information and information about ticketing about all these events at asiasociety.org. Now, 3 logistical things before I turn to our guests. Please turn off your cell phones. Second, there's a survey on your seat. Please fill it out and leave it with one of us or at the back of the room. It is your ticket into a raffle that will win you a free Asia Society membership, or free tickets if you're already a member. Third, at the end of the discussion, there will be time for Q&A. Please wait for the microphones so that those of us watching online can hear your questions. And for those of you online, please tweet your questions with the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive. Now to tonight's program. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing veteran New York Times correspondent Howard French for ChinaFile, our online magazine, about this very book. And I can tell you that experience was it was wonderful. He speaks broadly and deeply about his topic and many others. So you're in for a treat. There's practically nobody better to get him going than our own Orville Schell, publisher of ChinaFile, and the Arthur Ross, director of the Center on U.S. China Relations. So on the occasion of the publication of his new book, Everything Under the Heavens, which you can buy here at the back of the room, and which he will sign for you at the end of the evening, please join me in welcoming Howard French into a discussion of how the past helps shape China's push for global power.
Well, Howard, it's great to have you here. I really immensely enjoyed your book, and it's great to have all of you here. I think for any of you who sort of wonder how China, this country that has been reinventing itself in the last century in serial form, how it sort of connects with its past and how its foreign policy and its deportment in the wider world now relates to all of that history. This is a wonderful sort of an expedition into that very question, and I highly recommend it. Now, let's start off, Howard. You say at one point, it kind of intrigued me. It seems to me that
I'd like to interrupt you before you get started, just to say a word of thanks to you for having me. The audience won't know this, most of you, but this had initially been expected to be the very first event of this book tour back in March 14th, and there was a snowstorm, the biggest of the year, as it turns out. And so in our common wisdom, that is of the publisher and of the host, it was decided that we postpone it. And so I'm really grateful not just to be with you tonight, but for you to have been patient enough to have me back at this date. I also want to say a personal word about my friendship with Orville, which now dates, I can't put an exact year on it, but a good number of years. And he probably doesn't know this, but he's hosted me for each of the books or book efforts that I have had around the topic of China. And the first of these was not a nonfiction book, which is what most of you will know in terms of my work on China, but my photographic work about China when he was the dean of the School of Journalism at Berkeley. As I was gearing up to have my photography published before it had been exhibited various places but hadn't been put out into the world in published form yet, Orville had me as a guest in Berkeley. And so I have a very fond place in my heart for that work, and a special debt of gratitude for you for having recognized it and for having shown me the generosity you showed me back then.
Well, I have a great fondness for photography and really enjoyed yours, so it was a nice, happy occasion for both of us. So this book is interesting because, on the one hand, Howard says that he doesn't believe fully that one's sort of cultural and historical DNA, in other words, what happened in the past, determines absolutely what happens in the present. And yet, if I read this book correctly, boy, it certainly seems like you were suggesting that we better listen up and understand China's historical experience if we really want to understand what they're doing now.
So what I would say is that you're correct. I say there's a phrase somewhere early in the book where I say I don't believe in anything like a cultural or historical DNA that is determinative in terms of outcomes of countries or of their courses or paths. However, I do believe that, and I think we will probably get into this at great length in this conversation, that history and its raw material, which is narrative, is very powerful in terms of conditioning the way nations think of themselves and think about their places in the world. And this impact on the way nations think about themselves and their places in the world, in turn, comes to condition, if not completely determine, the behavior of nations and the opinions and feelings of peoples within nations, which itself provides an impulse to the state in terms of establishing the parameters for acceptable state behavior. It can't be completely decoupled from public opinion or national feeling. And so I don't want to be too mechanical about this. And I would certainly not like to descend into, every people pretty much suffers from the imposition of stereotypes upon them by others. And that's the last thing that I would like to have happen with this topic. But I think that China, having an extraordinarily rich and deep past, and having almost a cult of the past in terms of Chinese discussion about China, has a particularly strong aptitude for being influenced by its own, and views of the past, by the way, change over time, but its views of the past, period.
Do you think that and then I want you to describe how you sort of a catalog of those views that you think we should be mindful of as we look at China, but do you think that China, if we can speak of it as an entity, or at least the Chinese Communist Party and the government, is fully conscious of the way history conditions its sort of reflexes, its responses, its reactions to what goes on in the world, or do you think it's almost autonomic?
I think there's an element of both. So, the Chinese media falls under the control, to one extent or another, of propaganda system and censorship. Media within China is constantly referring to history, as should be the case in any event, right? And so it would be, I think, disingenuous for someone to say that we don't refer to history, we don't, in fact, that we don't use history. History is being used all the time, and if you pay careful attention to the media in China, which again has a state component to it, you can see the uses of history. At the same time, there are unconscious or unself-conscious aspects of this, where this is simply the way things are in China now.
So what would be some of the main sort of, the hammer hits the knee, the leg goes up. reactions that you identified in your research here that are sort of expectable ways that China responds that distinguishes it from, say, another country?
Well, I'll answer that, but I'll also add another piece to the response, which is a personal story. So I've spent time in China as a correspondent. I've spent time in China as a simple traveler. I'm a frequent visitor to China, and I've often had Chinese people refer to me lightly and very unselfconsciously when in conversation, when they realize that I have an interest in history, and they say to me, they wonder what could that be like for an American, because you guys don't have history. You have just a couple of hundred years. The frequency with which this kind of comment has come up over my years of experience in China is really quite striking.
What do you think they mean, or what do you think?
I think they're saying that, that we Chinese are exceptional in this regard, and especially vis-a-vis someone like you, an American. And I can't, why bother arguing with that? We do have 200 and some years of history.
Yeah. Okay, so how are they exceptional?
So the two quickest ways of answering your question really refer to two of the principal topics of my book. The book really deals with attitudes, Chinese attitudes toward peripheral countries, and particularly peripheral countries in the East and Southeast. And
peripheral in the sense they're bordering, not always insignificant.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Right. Geographically peripheral only. And how these relations or views of each other have changed over time. And the two biggest examples that I deal with in the book broadly are Japan and then Southeast Asia, which I go on to break up into its various components, Vietnam being probably the country that I treat at greatest length among the Southeast Asian countries. But if you were looking for the reflexive response, Japan and Southeast Asia provide very ready answers to your question. If you say the word Japan to a Chinese person, you're very likely to get a reflexive response. Some Chinese people, of course, will say, depending on the context of the conversation, yes, I've been to Japan, very nice country, we had a great time, shopping was terrific, everything was clean, it was very pleasant, well organized, et cetera, et cetera. Many other times, you will, without even any awareness of a provocation, sort of head off the rails into this reflexive domain of the Japanese are this, the Japanese are that, and a litany of historical slights, most of which are based, at least in part, on a strong foundation in history, but nonetheless which have been nursed in various ways, and usually never confronted with any countervailing narratives, which provide a kind of ready armatorium for Chinese people to kind of complain about.
And yet, I mean, within recent Chinese history, Mao Zedong was not anti-Japanese and made peace with them, and everything all was good. Hu Yaobang was, you might say, even quite pro-Japanese. And we have had periods where the relationship with Japan, even though there was a lot of animosity and historical grievance, has been quite even-keeled.
Sure. I tell a story in the book of the restoration of Sino-Japanese relations when the Prime Minister, under Prime Minister Tanaka in the 1970s, and he goes and meets with Mao Zedong, who's quite old and becoming frail at that point.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
And he begins to ritually apologize to Mao for all of the suffering imposed by the war, but Japan's imperial war upon China and upon the Chinese. And Mao cuts him off and says, "Don't be silly." He says, if it wasn't for what you guys did, I wouldn't be in charge. You helped, you guys took all the blood away from the nationalists and, blunt their thrust and changed the course of the war. So,
if I can find that quote.
I wish I could tell you what page it is, but I don't have quite that memory.
No, here he is. So you write that at the time of normalization of their relations, after Tanaka had expounded in this coy and abstract fashion that by invading China, Japan created a lot of trouble for China. And Mao replied, in a way that blended irony with surprising candor, "We must express our gratitude to Japan. If Japan didn't invade China, we," and presumably he's meaning the Communist Party, "would never have achieved the cooperation between the KMT and the Communist Party. We could never have developed and eventually taken political power for ourselves. It is due to Japan's help that we are able to meet here in Beijing."
So not only is that an inconceivable thing for anyone in contemporary China in a position of leadership or influence to say, it's for most living Chinese people within China, it's inconceivable that that should have been said in the first place.
Now, why is that so, in your estimation? What is happening that has sort of made and this is the key relationship in Asia, remember, Japan and China, not two insignificant countries. Why do you think we've gone in retrograde motion here on that relationship?
Because in the 1970s, in Mao's final years in power, China was seized with the idea of Japan's utility. Before Mao's demise and before the reform era began, China conceived of this utility in the sense of a country, a Western allied country that could be useful vis-a-vis the rest of the West in terms of achieving some kind of greater forbearance for China and suppleness toward China from other Western powers.
They're very utilitarian.
Very utilitarian, right. So after Mao's death, and particularly after the reform era begins under Deng Xiaoping, the need that China sensed for Japan then takes on a different kind of quality, and it becomes an economic need that China sees Japan as a storehouse of expertise, of capital, of potentially of investment that China can tap, and which would become vital for China's big catch-up efforts.
And indeed, Japan gave more overseas development aid to China than anyone.
Immense amounts of overseas development aid to China. I don't remember the figure again, but I tell this in great detail in my book. Perhaps 2/3 of Japan's overseas development aid went to China. We're talking about truly astounding amounts of money. Mao and, Deng and subsequent leaders would make very specific requests. We would like you to invest in the steel industry and bring your high-end steel here, or invest in this or that industry. And the Japanese essentially did it. And this allowed, a lot of things are going on in this compact. It allowed China to catch up very rapidly, which it indeed did. It was not the sole factor by any means, but it was quite important. But it allowed the Japanese to feel that they had made amends. They had made amends. They had, not, if not formal reparations, they had made amends for their crimes. There's something very Japanese about this. I don't think this is, people who have committed awful crimes tend not to like to talk about the awful
Howard
crimes.
was posted in Japan before he went to China, so he sort of has both sides of this equation.
But the Japanese are particularly averse to explicit conversations about uncomfortable things. And so for the Japanese, this was a perfect solution, that they could provide billions and billions and billions of dollars and all sorts of technical expertise and transplant industries into China. And magically, the Chinese would get over, in the Japanese view, the wounds of the past. Well, of course, that didn't happen. China absorbed the industry, the technology, the techniques, the capital, et cetera, and eventually, not so many years ago, displaced or surpassed Japan as the second largest economy in the world. And at that point, or from around that point onwards, China no longer felt that it needed Japan in the way that it needed Japan in the past. And so this, among other reasons, facilitated a turnabout in government attitudes, state-to-state attitudes from China toward Japan in terms of, treating with lots of solicitude the Japanese toward treating them in a kind of patronizing and sometimes offensive fashion.
So let's turn to the U.S. I mean, what you've described vis-a-vis Japan is a kind of a very unexpected evolution, I think, for many people, where we thought that the wounds of the Second World War, the savage occupation of China by Japan, and some other problems where they were still smarting from historical incidents had been sort of, in effect, overcome. How does the same sort of analysis you've just made vis-a-vis Japan apply, if it does, to the United States? How do you analyze the utility of seeing America one way and then another way? And what role did we play? What role did they play?
Well, so according to a view of 20th century history that's quite conventional in this country, and which I think has a serious basis in reality, the United States was a primary agent in the defeat of Japan in World War II, the primary agent, many would say. The conventional view of the war, of course, is that the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan formally ended the war, and that the Pacific campaign that the United States waged, island hopping across the Pacific toward the home islands of Japan, is what eventually sort of took the wind out of the Japanese and the will to fight away from the Japanese. The Chinese view the war, and especially the overcoming of the Japanese, rather differently, and they do so for reasons that I am sympathetic with, even if I don't completely agree with them. Remember the beginning of our conversation, which talked about the instrumentalization of history and how states try to mobilize narratives, and they do so. All states do this, and they do so for their own needs and toward their own ends. Well, the Chinese, emerging from World War II as an absolutely devastated country with a brand new political regime that had no prior experience of governing vast amounts of territory in a world that it saw as hostile, needed first and foremost to forge a sense of coherent rule over the country and national unity. And so that's pretty much what was done in the 1950s under the Communist Party. As China grew stronger and stronger, other needs arose in terms of narrative. By the 1980s, but toward the end of the 1980s, China had been undergoing economic transformation via the reform and opening initiatives launched by Deng Xiaoping at the beginning of that decade. And at the end of the decade, China experienced the Tiananmen Square protests and the deaths of students at the hands of the military in Beijing, et cetera, and a fresh and very important national trauma. China reverted to history to address that trauma, among other methods of overcoming the trauma. And the relevant piece of the history here is by creating a narrative of World War II which said that we, the Chinese, are victors in World War II, that we, the Chinese, through our own valor and our own sacrifice, were in fact principal, if not the principal, agents of victory in the eastern, what should I say, theater of the war. And so this has become in China now the conventional story of the war. And we saw just was it last year or 2 years ago that I think it was 2 years ago in Beijing they had a major anniversary of the end of the war in which.
But this is when the Korean president came.
That's right.
And yeah.
And Xi Jinping presided over an extraordinary military parade through the boulevards of Beijing, and Putin was there as well, and I don't believe any Western leaders went. But the whole purpose of this was to maybe not the only purpose of this, but a very important purpose of this was to reinforce this this view of the past, of Chinese agency, of Chinese valor, of China's will and determination and ability to overcome adversaries and to prevail in a world that is often hostile to it.
So this is interesting and important, this notion that the outside world, whether it's Japan or the U.S., has a sort of fundamentally adversarial and hostile intention. And I mean, this has deep historical roots too. Do you think that this presumption, which I would say in the last 5 years has probably grown, do you think this is something that we can historically manage and turn back? And if so, what should the United States do, given this notion that we see more and more of in China, hostile foreign forces? That this is an expression that's very commonly used now.
So I want to, before trying to address this, I want to draw you out on your timeline. You say within the last 5 years. I wonder, what do you, in your view, what does this date from?
Well, I think there's no particular sort of starting line, but I think what's surprising to all of us who've been around a while is that we've been through periods of real cordiality. I mean, the 80s were a relatively friendly period.
Right.
And the 90s, we had a setback after 89. But actually, under Jiang Zemin in the 90s, a friendly environment returned. I went with President Clinton, and I remember the bonhomie. It was quite astounding.
Sure.
But then something happened. So what happened? Why are we back now in the quasi-deep freeze?
Well, I think for at least two reasons. The first of them is that I didn't finish the anecdote about the change of history education that takes place after Tiananmen. Under Jiang Zemin, who was a very complicated figure who was very easy to underestimate. He had a kind of bonhomie about him, and he liked to sing in public, and you know, he could ham it up. Yeah. And this didn't, I think this was his own vision of how to be a modern politician on the global stage.
He wanted to be a kind of normal leader.
He really did. And it had a humorous dimension to it sometimes.
And if I may stop you,
Sure.
I want you to at some point describe what you think Xi's aspiration is. Does he want to be sort of run with the other leaders, or does he have his own vision of what leadership is?
Okay. That's a
That
delicious question. Anyway, I want to finish the thought about the history education. So, Jiang, who was a very personable character, and you know, was very at ease with himself in public and on the world stage, was also capable of doing things that were, you know, really kind of deeply calculated in terms of statecraft and hard-nosed. And one of them, which is kind of clashes with the public image we somehow have of him, right? And one of them, one very important of those things was the creation post-1989, post-Tiananmen, of the Nationalist Education Campaign. Patriotic Education Campaign is the official name of it, which is with us today still, and which I think has been really determinative of the change of attitudes that you described.
That came out of 89.
That came out of 89. You said the 90s were still pretty friendly. This isn't something that you can turn on a dime. You've had a generation of people educated one way. There's a shift in the education, a very fundamental shift in the emphases of national education, which a state like the Chinese state can really control rather tightly. And it takes years for this thing to give its full flush of effect, right? And so that's where we are now. A whole generation of people now has grown up under patriotic education, which is basically saying that China has nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of. And anybody who doesn't like what we have to say or who we are or whatever should just, I'll let you fill in the blank with the rude expression. I think, you know, this was Jiang's doing. This was his idea, and he saw it through to completion, and I think it's one of his greatest legacies. What would she like to do? So Jiang had to ingratiate himself. Here's Jiang Zemin's task, the leader in the 1990s.
Ingratiate, that's an interesting way to put it. I think
Yeah.
you're right about that.
Jiang had to ingratiate himself from a position of relative weakness on the world stage to get other countries to play along with China, to really fundamentally allow China successfully, and as it was, into the World Trade Organization, to kind of greet China as a peer in the system of world leadership. Jiang was really quite successful overall in doing this. Under Xi Jinping, the challenge is totally different. China is the world's second largest, industrial powerhouse of the world. China has, achievements too long to list that go to measurements of comprehensive national power. China may not be a true full rival yet of the United States in those terms, but it's in the picture and is moving forward. And so Xi's task is not to ingratiate himself. Xi's task is to impose himself, to say, we've arrived. Here we are.
China dream.
Deal with it, right? This is who we are, and all that stuff that was in patriotic education for the last generation about we're not apologizing has now become manifest.
No more Tao Guang Yang Hui, hide your head and bide your time.
Bide your time, correct.
So many thoughts are sailing through my head here. Let me ask you this. I remember vividly in the early 80s when Deng Xiaoping came to power, and you'll all remember, this was very surprising. Mao died, the Gang of Four, his wife got cashiered, locked up, put on trial. And suddenly we got this amazing reform program of reform and opening. And a lot of people thought at the time, well, the revolution's gone. What parts of the revolution do you think we're still living with today? In other words, that whole experience of many decades, what lingers on in the bloodstream of China from Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Revolution?
That's a great question and a difficult question. So China is not in any meaningful way, economically speaking, a communist or socialist country, although it clings to that nomenclature and insists, in fact, officially, that it uses socialism as a system of thought, although it's quite hard to see that in terms of actual processes on the ground in terms of economic management. I think the thing that, the most important thing that lingers is this sense of a tightly woven and increasingly substantial and it would seem durable sense of national narrative and of national return to, and this was after all Mao's ideal, his goal, return to the place that China thought then, thinks now, and probably will always think, is its natural place in the world, which is in the front rank of nations, and if not absolutely preeminent, quite close to it, with few peers. That China is a very, very special place that commands respect and deference from others in the world.
It waited a long time, and now it's chinned itself up through hard work, and it's back.
That's what Mao was about. That's what Deng was about. That's what Jiang Zemin was about. That's what Xi Jinping is about. The needs of the moment changed. The personal styles of each of those leaders were different, but that goal, or those goals, have remained consistent.
One question we touched on very briefly when we were talking in my office was that you clearly recognize and are fascinated by sort of the historical, the fund of experience that is playing into the present and the way China acts in the current world. And yet, in many regards, I think the their version of history is often quite idiosyncratic and quite distorted. Do you think it's necessary for China to come to some honest assessment of its history? I mean, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the anti-rightist campaign, all of these rather brutal movements against their own people, in order for it to be a really great power, a great civilization, and above all, I would say, a healthy society? Or do you think it can dodge that bullet?
So the historical answer to this question is that judgment in Chinese society comes with change of regime. That each dynasty writes the official history of the preceding dynasty. And that this judgment of each present dynasty of the preceding dynasty is not just official, but it's unimpeachable. That's the story. There's no need to rummage through unpleasant things or to issue interim judgments that may be uncomfortable or inconvenient about the present dynasty, because that exercise is deferred in a sense through the mechanisms of succession that have occurred over history from one era to another via dynastic change.
But surely the Chinese Communist Party is not saying, oh, don't worry, wait till the next dynasty.
No dynasty said that,
yeah.
But that's how it always worked.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that this pattern has kind of anchored itself deeply in terms of, I think that the Chinese Communist Party, I don't mean to suggest to anyone in the audience that it faces, being erased from history or overcome or toppled anytime in the foreseeable future. But it knows the power of historical judgment very well. You can see this there are many reasons for China the Chinese state, the Chinese Communist Party, to wish to exercise its vision of territorial integrity over China, right? Meaning, in particular, so the areas that come under greatest tension are Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, right? But one of the reasons, there are many reasons why the Chinese state would want to insist, like almost any state, on retaining its integrity and protecting it and defending it from any threat, right? And preventing any, what the Chinese use this beautiful neologism in English of splitism, that they're preventing any splitism, right? But one of the reasons is certainly history. That you can look at every dynasty as a record of performance vis-a-vis the question that you have an elegant phrase about memory shape of China. China, the thing we call China, has been a very dynamic entity over the ages that has expanded and contracted depending on the successes of any given dynasty vis-a-vis surrounding countries or peoples, right? And the Chinese people, a Chinese school child can tell you, can answer in simple terms which dynasties were successful in terms of keeping China big and whole, and which ones, like the Song, were forced to surrender a lot of territory.
Or even the Ming.
Or even the Ming, correct, right? And so there's this extra motive that's rooted in history that says, no, we're going to be judged one day. We know we too will be judged one day. And this will be one of the prime criteria of judgment, and we don't want to be judged down on this.
Okay, so just for the record, China now has filled out all of the boundaries of the old Qing dynasty, which included Xinjiang, Tibet, Manchuria, Inner Mongolia. They lost Outer Mongolia. So if that is the trend line now for China to reunify itself in this sort of patriotic fluorescence, this rejuvenation, why shouldn't we, the Americans, be willing to say to China, good, it's a long time coming, you're big, you're wealthy, you're powerful, and you can have your Monroe Doctrine too in the South China Sea. We have ours, you take yours. What's wrong with that?
Somebody flashed a card a few minutes ago that said we have 5 minutes left until the audience questions.
How can we resolve this in 5 minutes?
Right. So the United States has, in effect, said all but for the question of Taiwan,
Yeah.
which would take another hour to sort out, right? Great, congratulations. China raises the specter of American and other outside interference in places like Tibet, et cetera, that are a nuisance to it. But there's no serious person in the United States who questions in government or in policy circles that Tibet belongs to China.
Only the Communist Party presumes that people want to split it off.
Correct. Yeah. So so a lot of the heavy lifting that you've asked about has been done. You're asking about something supplemental here, which is the South China Sea.
Well, a nice piece of real estate.
Which is not tangible real estate. It's water.
Yeah.
Right? It's not.
Well, they're building more and more islands every day.
So the islands that they have built are I believe, less than 3 square miles total. So South China Sea is a huge expanse of water, and it's not a lot of territory, right?
Yeah.
And so to ask that the United States defer to China, or to cede is a better word, to China control of the South China Sea, is to ask something of the United States that exceeds the powers of the United States, because there are other bordering nations which have their claims rooted in law to the waters of the South China Sea.
But should we protect those claims of other countries? Why is it in our interest to interfere there?
Well, so because interfere is your word, not mine. To cede what you initially asked about to China would be to say, in effect, to those countries 2 things that I think the United States deems would be too costly to its own standing in the world. Cede their interests when they don't belong to us to cede in the first place, and cede our presumed attachment to international law, from which a lot of we have been inconsistent with many international laws, but in general, one might say that a lot of American prestige in the world derives from a sense of respect for law.
Yeah.
And so to cede those 2 things, I think most people in the sort of policy-making world conclude properly would be very costly to the United States. You don't have to see this strictly in a geopolitical, us versus them kind of way to understand that.
Do you think, as you have a long section on the South China Sea, do you think there's any prospect that the U.S. and China could come to some agreement where they would say, together we will patrol, we will manage the sea lanes, keep them open? Do you think we can, given all of the other things your book has said, would suppose that China probably isn't ready to make that kind of a deal?
I think that
it wants superiority, not equality.
I think that we're probably heading in a different direction, and the direction I sense we're heading in is one that conforms with kind of other broad patterns of history between great powers, and that's a period of constant testing, and that a stable modus vivendi will emerge one of 2 ways, either through a successful management of this testing over time, or through war. I hope that we don't have a war. I don't wish that upon anyone. I can't imagine it being good for anyone. But this is what we've seen across history, and we would be foolish to discount the possibility that the United States and China could come to war over the South China Sea, even though if you ask most rational people in either society in positions of influence and power, they would tell you, we don't want to fight a war over that body of water. So the alternative is testing, and the testing, the sort of ultimate outcome of a prolonged period of testing that I sort of can imagine is that China builds a few more aircraft carriers, it continues to build up its military strength, the United States finds reaches the kind of practical limits of what it wishes to deploy in terms of men and materiel in East Asia and the sorts of alliance relationships with which it can sustain in that part of the world, and a balance emerges. And around that balance, kind of rules of the road and a kind of a more rules-based sense of what will be permissible.
And yet, it seems to me the whole thrust of your conclusion is that China is on the march. It feels it has a rightful place particularly in Asia, but also in the world. Mm-hmm. That in many ways, countries like Japan and the U.S. are in the way, and it is not our business to be there. Now, Japan may be another question. Given that, it's very hard for me to imagine, I mean, if you subscribe to those sort of trend lines, that we could come to some accommodation.
So I was told last question, I should make this the last question.
Is there actually a sign up there?
The audience can't see, I'm going to answer this one. The audience can't see this byplay, but I'm going to be fair to the management here. So I think we're in a very dangerous period overall. Yeah. I think my sense of the period of maximum danger is the next 10 to 15 years. And the reason why I think this is the most dangerous period is that China is feeling its oats. Yeah. But China is also aware of pending sharp limitations to its power that will come in the form of its eventual or gradual transformation into what I'm going to call a normal economy. And a normal economy means not a big economy that grows 8, 10, 12% a year anymore, but rather an economy that grows 3, 4, in really, really good times, 5% a year. Mm-hmm. Maybe sometimes 1 or 2% a year. But that's where China is going to be one day or another, and probably sooner rather than later. Yeah. So there's an awareness of that, and there's an awareness that coupled with that, China is going to face a demographic crisis, or to be less dramatic, change or transition of a size and scope that has never been seen before in the world, and that this is going to bring immense social costs. By 2050, China will have 400 million people over the age of 65.
And they have no immigration.
400 million people over the age of 65. Now, what happens to people who are over 65? I'm not going to linger on that question. I lost both of my parents in the not so distant past. It's costly. It drags out. You think about the national scale it imposes. We are a rich country, right? And we are in a constant battle with ourselves about how to take care of basic needs like this. China, after 40 years of very fast economic growth, is as wealthy on a per capita basis as Japan was in 1970. And it doesn't have a robust social safety net at all yet. And this avalanche of aging is about to hit it. And with a per capita basis, GDP wealth like Japan in the 1970s, not like America today or Japan today or Italy or Finland or Korea today, all of which are rich societies wrestling with questions of social costs and pension and retirement and healthcare, et cetera. China with the wealth of Japan in 1970 on a scale never seen before in history is going to have to deal with all of this. And I think this means for the Chinese leadership, knowing that the economy is going to slow down, the aging of the population will become what do you call it? I'm losing my economic terms. It's a magnifier of this effect, right? That they have a moment of opportunity now. And that moment of opportunity, I think, is called the next 10 or 15 years. And that they should lock in as many gains as they can now, because they know that in 10 or 15 years, the bill is going to come due in a horrendous way. And they will be constrained. Whatever they might wish to do, they're going to be constrained by the costs of this transition.
So last question, if the next 10 years is a period where they've got to lock in all their gains,
right,
what should the United States do? How should we deport ourselves in the face of this challenge?
I think the United States should, there are a lot of things that we have been doing that I think were well advised up until January. We should nurture healthy and robust alliance relationships in the region. We should maintain the best bilateral ties we can with China. We should engage China at every level that we can, including the military level. We should try to prevent the emergence of arms races in new technological domains wherever possible. And we should welcome China's initiatives in the global system. This is the one area where we did not do so well among the various things I've mentioned under the Obama administration. When China launches an investment bank for infrastructure in Asia, or an initiative like the like One Belt, One Road to integrate the economies and to build things across Asia, we should say fine. We shouldn't just say fine, we should say we'd like to be a charter member. Let's join, let's get involved, let's lend our expertise. We have something to contribute here. To make China feel more like they are not regarded as unwelcome insurgents and more like partners. And that this is the best hope of, there's no way a rivalry is going to be avoided.
But of course, our political systems and value systems make it almost impossible to jump over that sense of something dividing us and even making us at least in contradiction, if not rivals.
Well, so there's anxiety that comes with being an incumbent, looking in the rearview mirror and seeing somebody gaining on you. That's just the way it is.
Do you think it matters that our political systems are so different in our calculus of that person that we see in the rearview mirror?
Yes. Yeah, so I tell my students what kind of society China becomes in the future is the most important question in the world.
Yeah.
I don't want China to be fit under sort of rubric A, B, or C through any perverse personal needs of my own. I want good things for China as a human being. And the more humane and the more open China becomes as a polity and as a civilization, the better it is, not just for Chinese people, but for everybody.
Listen, we can go on forever here, but let's get to you. We will pass microphones, so raise your hands if you have a question for Howard. Let's start right over here, and then we'll go back there. And introduce yourself, and let's keep your questions as short as possible.
Hello, my name is Guy Martin, and I'm curious about how well China's historical worldview incorporates the country's various ethnic minorities.
Okay, so you can take this as a long-term story, or you can take this as a short-term story. I find the long-term story more interesting and maybe even eventually more important. Chineseness is the greatest story that exists in the world. What does that mean? That means that some people from the Yellow River Valley over a long period of time managed to convince a lot of other people of heterodox origins that they shared something in common, which we have come to recognize as being Chinese. That's an incredible trick. Most of those other people were not Chinese in any meaningful way of thinking, if you go back far enough in time. And yet today, none of them remember, almost none of them, remember their non-Chineseness. I'm not talking about the minorities. I'm talking about people who call themselves Han. So Han, the largest ethnic group of China, has no real scientific basis, right? By coincidence, in the Han Dynasty, a lot of present southern China was conquered and assimilated into China. Those people were not Chinese, but they think of themselves completely as Chinese now. And they not just Chinese, but they call themselves the majority ethnic group. This is an amazing thing. It's really, truly, I mean, but think of the standards of our society. Granted, we only have 200 years, but everybody remains who they think they are from whenever, right? The Chinese have managed to completely, not completely, but very largely overcome that, granted over a longer time scale. And I think that Chinese, meaning the Chinese state, and I think this is consistent pre-1949 and post-1949, has a great confidence in its ability to carry this off and takes a very long view of these ethnic questions, and thinks that given time, this is part of where the idea is, if only you Westerners would bug off and stop interfering in Tibet or interfering in the question of Tibet or the question of this or that minority group. We know what we're doing. These people will become...
We'll get the melting pot going.
We'll get the melting pot going. It'll just happen.
Are they right?
Well, they've been right. Historically, they've been largely right.
But are they right now?
Well, so,
in the short run?
So here's the trick. You know, the rules of the game have changed because the world has become everything. You know, the world has become transformed by human movement, communication, education, exchanges of all kinds. Of course, we tried just even to mention the internet, but this has sort of thrown kind of junk into the works of this Chinese project and made it much more complicated. But this notion, so what's happening in China, in Tibet today, one of the many things that the Chinese state is trying to do in Tibet is to take Tibetan nomads and to settle them in villages. So to take nomadic peoples and to make them sedentary people and to give them all kinds of help and assistance and things like that, public health and education, et cetera, on and on. And this is the part of the project is that over time they'll just become like any other Chinese people, right? They're not foolish for thinking that because they have this legendary 5,000 years of history that proves that that can actually work. However, in today's context, where Tibetan people have links with other peoples who have grievances based on minority status and have an awareness of international sensitivities to minority rights and have cross-border movements of all kinds and have, you know, a sense of international law and a readiness to appeal to other people's sense of fairness based in international law and things like that. It's just a vastly more difficult thing. So I don't think that says it's possible or impossible. I just think that it means that the games like this will be extended over a much longer period of time before we know.
But they could blow up in the meanwhile.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, right back here.
Hi, my name's Justin Cox from Teachers College Columbia. My question is for both of you. With regard to the healthy society you mentioned earlier, what do you guys think the Chinese people's greatest strengths are today, and what are its greatest weaknesses that could potentially undermine a better China, which we all hope for? Thank you.
You first.
So the greatest strength is self-confidence. I never finish being astounded by Chinese self-belief. Chinese people, you asked me earlier, and I didn't answer the question. He asked me in his office before we came out, and he didn't ask me the question in the same version, but he asked me somewhat differently. And I want to come back to your question. He said, does history matter? You asked me that just bluntly, you know, in your office. And I said, I have an answer for you. I think that one of the reasons why so many so-called developing countries have had such a difficult time establishing a footing in the world is that their history was interrupted via imperialism, that other people came in and imposed themselves on them, and their own sense of an emerging coherence via narrative, not just via economic development or some kind of toy box form of state sovereignty, but their sense of, an organic sense of a narrative was completely derailed. And it's easy to underestimate the importance of this, and because the Chinese narrative is so long and so deep and has been pounded upon with such insistence over the eons, it has become a particularly important factor in Chineseness and in Chinese success. So I like to tell a story of when I was in my last months in Japan. I lived in Japan for 5 years, and I began to study Chinese in those last months. And in my second lesson with a Chinese teacher, I had a woman come to my house to tutor me. She said to me, Mr. French, you know, you seem like a decent guy, so I think I should tell you something. I said, okay. I had no idea where she was going, right? I said, okay, what is it? She said, Chinese people are the smartest people in the world. Just apropos of nothing.
A little chauvinism.
I thought, well, okay. That tells me something about being Chinese, right? I didn't argue with her. What's the point, right? So to cut quick to the other question, what's Chinese greatest weakness? I think China's, or Chinese people's greatest weakness is insecurity. It might seem like a paradox, right? So confidence and insecurity. China twins them like nobody else. Confidence like nobody else, insecurity like nobody else. And I think China would be in a healthier place if it were a little less confident and a lot less insecure.
Well, let's see, what do I think? I'm married to a Chinese, so I have a good control group to sort of do some research. The one thing that really deeply impresses me is how extraordinarily hardworking, Chinese with whom I've been acquainted are, and how focused they can become. I mean, unlike Americans, which just seem utterly distractible. So that's an extraordinary trait, and I think it does suggest why there's been so much success, that if left to their own devices to actually do what they can do and want to do, Chinese are extraordinarily focused, determined, and effective. The weaknesses, this is a hard one. I sometimes worry that the distortions in their sort of ability to understand things, and some of this is caused by official media, by education. We have versions of this in our country as well, but can really make China's ability to see things realistically and in a true fashion compromises it. And we were speaking about the South China Sea, projections abroad, all of these things. I think in many ways, I'm deeply fearful that that distortion of understanding of what's out there may lead to some very precipitous, dangerous, and ultimately self-defeating actions. And it's Confucius loved the notion of shoshen, reflection, to examine yourself. And I find that one of the weaknesses, I think, of the revolution has been an absence of that capacity of self-examination. Okay, another question. Let's go right here. Gentlemen, yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Henry Nass. I'm wondering, does China consider the Chinese Communist Party something different than the ruling of China by a sort of dynasty, not of a family line, but of a political line in theory?
I don't, my own sense is that I would not think that most Chinese people think of the Chinese Communist Party as a dynasty. I think that if you spoke to a historian or you spoke to an intellectual or a well-read or curious person, you could tease out an analogy with them without too much difficulty, but I don't think in the normal course of things people think of the Chinese Communist Party as a dynasty. And one among many reasons for this is, if you want to, dynasties have very particular rules that usually have to do with a ruling family and a bloodline, right? And so just at the very most superficial level, this comparison breaks down, right? I mean, you look across the border with North Korea, you have a dynasty. China, Mao Zedong, who perhaps could have pulled it off, never tried to impose his offspring. His wife made a bid for power, but never as would not have appeared to have been as the absolute ruler herself. He never tried to put his son forward as his son, the son who, his favored son died in the Korean War, as it happens, but there was no hint of that, right? So I don't think that gets us very far in terms of just the sort of normal workaday thinking about what kind of nation China is.
Right here, the gentleman with the beard. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question, please. Do the Uyghurs, do they play any role in China's quest for global power? For example, like, will China staff their embassies in the Turkic republics of the former Soviet Union or the Republic of Turkey as interpreters, or even the broader, like, non-Turkic Islamic worlds? Perhaps they could be like cultural interpreters, something like that?
I have no information about that.
My impression, and I don't have any chapter and verse, is that, that there is a very complicated adversarial relationship with Uyghurs, and that it's very difficult for a Uyghur to actually get into sort of trusted circles. I think there are some, but there is a kind of a sense of uncertainty. So I don't know the answer in terms of numbers, but I think it's very hard for Uyghurs to integrate fully into the sort of bureaucracy in a way that your question, I think, suggests.
I would be surprised if an important part of Chinese diplomacy towards Central Asia was pushing Uyghurs into positions of, sort of putting them in evidence in embassies and things like that. I don't think the Chinese feel a need to do that.
One last question. Right here, this young woman. Well, either person. We can only do one more question. All right, take this woman right here.
Good evening. My name is Anika Price. My question is one that I think a lot of Americans have in their minds. Do you think that China will surpass the U.S. as the ultimate global power, and if so, by what means?
That's a good question to end on.
Yeah, well, it's a perfectly reasonable question. I mean, I think a lot of people in this country, a lot of people in China, and a lot of people around the world are wondering this. I should first say that China is more than 20% of the world's population. And China, you couple that with the fact that China is, and has always been, by an astounding measure, the largest society in its part of the world, has occupied a place of preeminence in its part of the world. This is a very important theme of my book, basically from the beginning, right? And so I think we should be generous toward China and toward Chinese people in seeing it as normal that they should be the leaders.
They're a little like us.
Yeah, yeah. They're even more like us than we are. That the Chinese should be, number one, it strikes Chinese people for good reason as a normal thing, that they don't even have to think about it. It's a kind of normal, it's a return to the norm, basically.
In this sense, his book is wonderful, because you do get a real sense of where that imprint comes from, historically.
So the practical question about whether this can happen in our lifetimes or in the foreseeable future is not a fully answerable question. Part of it I addressed in my little passage where I talked about this 10 or 15 years of moment of high risk with the demographic crunch that's coming, which I think has been really very vastly underappreciated in this country in thinking about China. I think Xi Jinping is fully aware of what this means for China, and a lot of current behavior can be explained in part by an awareness of what's coming in terms of demographic and economic shift that lies ahead. So, as I said, China has grown for 40 years at an astounding rate, and it has a per capita income equal to Japan in 1970. To catch up to which is, I think, something like 1/5 of the per capita income of the United States. To get to parity, how to become number one, it depends on your definition. So does it mean per capita income on a par with the United States? I think that is probably not realistic. There's a real question about whether the planet could tolerate that. And by the way, if that were to happen, that would mean not only was it happening in China, but it was happening in India, it was happening in large parts of Africa, it was happening in many places. And it's really, it becomes very hard to see our way through to that on a number of levels. But China could very easily, let me say, it's very easy to imagine China emerging in 10 or 15 years with the world's largest economy. Some people were predicting it for right around now to begin with, and various things happened to sort of delay that moment, right? But the question then becomes, so is that important?
And of course, that presupposes just linear.
Right.
I mean, that nothing happens.
Right.
We just kind of go along, and the world doesn't often work that way.
It doesn't work that way. But let's assume it were to happen. The more interesting question is, well, does that matter? Who does it matter to? Is it of any practical value to China to simply be able to say we're the world's largest economy? Or does it have any practical impact on the United States that China's economy with 4 times as many people is as large as our economy is? I don't think that tells us very much.
Well, Americans do like to be number one.
Well, we do like to be number one. Being number one feels good, but it doesn't have a necessary practical utility to it.
That's right.
And so that would be my sort of best muddy answer. I'm sorry if it's not more satisfying.
Well, listen, join me in thanking Howard French, and his book is for sale outside.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.